Africa as agriculture has grown tremendously over the past 50 years. But essentially in terms of output, in terms of the sector, in terms of the process of production, there are still challenges that need to be overcome. With more than 60% of the unused arable lands in the globe, Africa has the duty to make a substantial contribution to feeding the world in the 21st century. Looking at the bottlenecks from the financing side, our view is that banks, commercial banks' liability profile doesn't allow them to engage in long-term lending. There are also still issues of collateral security in the financing of agriculture. Issues of land titles, for instance, are still outstanding. We also see a weak public agriculture development institution in terms of research, marketing, and a lack of credible agriculture corporate unions, weak corporate structure, legal structure of the entities operating in the sector. Now, to discuss this very important subject, we have on this table Mr. Gert Haus, who is the Chief Financial Officer of the IDC, Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa. Next to Gert is Mr. Brad Gibbs, who is the Managing Partner of Mara Group. Next to Brad is Ade Freeman, who is a lead agribusiness specialist at the World Bank. Then followed by Stuart Kerr, who is the Director of Legal and Regulatory for the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And then Akobundu Ejasa, who is the Director of Private Equity at OPEC. Let me start with Gert. Private capital flows in Africa. Is the momentum expected to accelerate, and into which industrial areas of economic activity, and how do you see it?
Thank you. Thank you, Program Director. Indeed, that is the question which I was asked to answer, and let me just repeat it. Private capital flows into Africa. Is the momentum expected to accelerate, and into which areas of economic activity? I work at the Industrial Development Corporation, as was said, in South Africa. We do project work in the rest of the continent, not only the southern area, but indeed the whole of Africa and also North Africa. And the answer to that question is most certainly yes. Is the momentum expected to accelerate? We believe that the momentum is indeed expected to accelerate, and I will briefly touch on the investment landscape, the players or the funders, and also then some specific opportunities, some of which were already said this morning. I will just briefly refer to those rather than to repeat it. If we look at the investment landscape, we know that the growth performance and the prospects of Africa is indeed significantly ahead of the rest of the world. Historically, in the last couple of years, the current year, 2013, and also the IMF expectations for 2014 and 2015. the ease of doing business. We had the World Bank's rating on doing business in 2013, and we saw that many countries, including Mauritius, South Africa, Tunisia, Rwanda, Botswana, Ghana, Seychelles, Namibia, and others, they were above China, for example, also above Brazil, well-known industrialized countries, but in terms of ease of doing business, many of these African countries exceed those. Global competitiveness, that was the World Economic Forum's competitiveness index, where once again countries like Mauritius, South Africa are ahead of Brazil, India, Russia, and many other countries are in the top layer, including Rwanda, Botswana, Morocco, and others. We, of course, have a massive consumer market with a population of 1.1 billion people, a relatively young market, a growing market, increasing, urbanizing, providing very significant opportunities for capital flows. Political stability, mentioned this morning, we know that enormous progress has been made with increasing numbers of countries being democratically elected, and, for example, coup d'etats significantly lower than 20 or even 10 years ago. And then foreign direct investment, which was also discussed this morning. Africa being one of the few regions where FDIs are actually still increasing on a year-to-year basis. Who are the funders? The public sector will remain a dominant player in this area. The DFIs, historically, but also increasingly interested, and there we include the IFC, the African Development Bank, the European DFIs, the Proparcos, the DGs, FMO, and also certain ones in South Africa, including the IDC, the Development Bank, do have continental mandates. The pension funds, as was said in the previous panel, still largely untapped and unrealized, but a very significant opportunity for increasing participation by pension funds. The emerging markets, countries like China, India, Turkey, increasingly interested in Africa, and of course the sovereign wealth funds. The sovereign wealth funds from China, from the Middle East, from India, many of them are very active already in Africa, and they do indeed in the process of increasing their footprint. We do see an increased appetite for triple Ps, the public-private partnerships. Not many examples of successful triple Ps, still challenges, specifically where countries need to work together, to cooperate, but tremendous potential for triple Ps. And then finally, private equity. Now, my colleague here will, I'm sure, say more about that, but there are currently 57 Africa-focused private equity funds operating on the continent. 57 active ones. The numbers are gradually growing, and the investments into private equity opportunities are indeed expanding. Which are the areas of opportunities as we see it? And I only had 5 minutes, which are already up. But very briefly, indeed, agriculture and agro-processing, very significant opportunities in that area. Secondly, consumer goods. Thirdly, banking and financial services. Fourthly, telecommunications, tourism and related activities, infrastructure, and then mining and minerals beneficiation. I just want to add with a quote, which I got from the Emerging Markets Private Equity Association, the Global Limited Partners Survey of 2013. It said, funds focused on Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa are expected to deliver the highest net returns over the next 2 years. A quote from that specific publication.
Yeah.
Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you very much, Brad. Thank you. Let's ask Brad now to tell us about his interests and views on Africa manufacturing sector but from the perspective of agriculture.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that. Recognizing that this panel stands between you and lunch, I will be succinct. So just some quick background. Mara Group is a diversified holding company. We have investments in real estate, packaging, IT services, and agriculture, with operations in 19 African countries. Speaking particularly about manufacturing and agribusiness, we see a tremendous opportunity, and really echoing Harriet's comments, clearly a lot of capital going into the market. I must say, though, that agriculture in Africa is not for the faint of heart. We're in the process of commercializing a 9,300 hectare farm in eastern Uganda, and while there's a tremendous amount of opportunity with respect to unmet local demand, the constraints and issues that one faces in actually bringing untilled soil into productive use are significant. Where we, given the experience that we've been having and the opportunities that we've been evaluating, I think an area of agribusiness which is really interesting is obviously processing, handling, and storage. In particular, Africa is net short storage, and storage, when you don't have storage, it actually increases price volatility. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity, and frankly, all of the people on this panel can contribute to various solutions to actually help increase the degree of beneficiation and professionalism in the value chain in agribusiness. So I think that is an area worthy of further discussion and debate. Additionally, just echoing Jean-Louis' comments about financing agribusiness financing agribusiness in Africa, there is this concern or this issue associated with duration. And I think the other issue, which probably merits some further discussion, is that some of the crops which are most financeable are probably the most problematic. So for example, we've been evaluating cassava-based ethanol plants. Ethanol is, given the global market, is financeable in that one can enter into various offtake agreements. However, when it comes to Africa's development, I think there's some healthy skepticism as to whether or not cassava used for ethanol is necessarily the best use of that land. Obviously, the whole food for fuel debate is quite nuanced. So the issue is designing solutions and structures whereby one can actually assist in financing and developing local markets for local route to market and the beneficiation of crops as opposed to crops for export. With that, I'll turn over back to Jean-Louis.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being so brief and direct to the point. Let me ask Ade, who is a lead agribusiness specialist at World Bank, to tell us about the World Bank strategy for engaging private sector in support of agribusiness development.
Yeah, thanks, Jean-Louis. Actually, I'll be talking about the World Bank Group. I think it's an important point to make because supporting agriculture and agribusiness comes from both the public sector and the private sector. So a lot of what I'll talk will cover both the bank, IBRD, IDA, as well as IFC's support for agribusiness, which is also significant. In terms of the strategic framework that guides our work in this sector, it is actually addressed or governed by the World Development Report of 2008, Agriculture for Development, as well as some subsequent agricultural action plans that the World Bank Group has developed. And this actually frames the agenda, including how the bank engages with the private sector. As we know that agriculture has suffered a lot in terms of investments, but we have seen an uptick, an increase in funding. For example, within the bank group aggregate spending on agriculture increased from about $4.1 billion in the fiscal year 2006-2008. And currently it's around projected to be around $8 to $10 billion in 2013 to 2015 fiscal year. That's significant. It's up significantly. We also see in terms of the regional distribution that Africa is increasing from about $1.5 billion in 2010-2012, and this is projected to increase to about $2.6 billion in 2013-2015. At the end of the day, really this involves investment in Africa. Will be about 25%, about a quarter of the aggregate spending on agriculture and agribusiness, which is significant considering that there are a lot of other regions that the bank is involved in. In addition to investment spending, the bank also provides analytical support in terms of knowledge, advisory services across the institution that provides policy advice as well as informs investments in the sector. So the body of work that we're talking about is pretty significant. Recently, the bank did a study, and I think I had a couple of copies around Growing Africa. And one of the things that came out in this study was that the investment that we're talking about, or the opportunities, are significant, and I think Gert and Brad talked about it. We're looking at an industry that is estimated to about $1 trillion in 2030. It is really significant. This is up for around 300 billion right now. So really more than a threefold increase in the opportunities created. I think we've talked about some of the drivers: income growth, urbanization, the drive fueling this. And with this comes significant opportunities for investments in agriculture and agribusiness. And really, it is this trend that actually shapes the bank's investments and its support to the private sector in the region, because we see all of this. Another interesting thing that is happening, and I think Brad talked about, is in African agribusiness, which is also providing an opportunity for the bank group, is the increasing interest of the private sector. 10 years ago, if you were talking about agricultural investments in Africa, the private sector would be absent. We wouldn't be seeing them. In fact, we had a situation where we struggled to find private sector actors. But now, we're more concerned about issues like land grabbing and other issues rather than the role of the private sector. So we'll see this tremendous increase in the private sector in this. And like I said, these trends actually underscore the bank's strategy for engaging with the private sector. Recently, the bank released its new strategy, which has two ambitious goals: eradicating extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. We can read about that. But these goals actually are consistent with what we've been doing all along. And central to this, to realizing this strategy, is engagement with the private sector. We do realize that the private sector has significant expertise, capital, that can be used in support of this transformation in Africa. The bank also realizes that the private sector is the main driver of jobs. About 90% of jobs in developing countries are created in the private sector. So if we're serious about jobs, we really need to engage with the private sector. There are three broad areas where the bank provides support. There's a lot more, but I'll just limit it to these three. And I'll give some examples of how we do it. The first is to make sure that we have a policy environment that supports the private sector, that actually encourages private sector engagement. We know that in the past, countries were antagonistic towards the private sector, and they did this in many different ways, legally, in terms of the policies, and not creating the right incentives. So one of the major thrusts for the bank is to ensure that in our engagement with countries, we really try to make sure that the private...
Ade, I'm sorry, because we asked to reduce the time, so that I want to give an opportunity to others also to to speak. Because we are behind schedule, and there is a ceremony just after that with the Prime Minister of Cote d'Ivoire, who is already here. So if you allow me, I will give the opportunity to the two others to speak at least 2 or 3 minutes each, because you've passed your 5 minutes. That's a problem.
Okay, I'll just leave it there. But I just wanted to say there are 3 areas: policy support, providing the knowledge from the bank, and also making sure that we address critical constraints.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry. Yeah, Stuart, just in 2 minutes, can you tell us how the MCC integrate private sector perspective in its agribusiness sector and investment in Africa?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Edge, I'd like to thanks to African Investor for including MCC in the event. We appreciate it. Just a minute on MCC, because we're not that widely known and often misunderstand where people think they know us. We're an independent government agency founded in 2004 with a very large focus on establishing a more conducive environment for private sector-led economic growth, including in agriculture, but other areas. We provide very large grants, we call compacts, to a limited number of developing countries, most of whom are in Africa. I think we have maybe 24, 25 compacts either active or under negotiation now. Average compacts since we were formed in 2004, about $340 million per country. pure grant. They're not even a soft IDA credit or anything like that. And they last 5 years very strictly, no extensions. Countries have to earn eligibility through better performance relative to peer countries in 3 areas: economic freedom, investing in people, and ruling justly. And it's all determined through indicators as objective as we can find that are produced by the World Bank, IMF, UN, WHO, and others. And then once a country is qualified, we go through, with the country leading the process, an economic constraints analysis. And right at the beginning of that engagement, we initiate what we call an investment opportunity analysis. And that is very focused on communicating with the private sector locally and those private sector companies from abroad that are interested in or involved already in those countries. We try and engage at the beginning as broadly as possible, both to look for areas of common interest, but also to get a better feeling for the business environment in any country beyond just mere statistics. We work through the embassies, Department of Commerce, Chambers of Commerce, and other private sources to find out who is involved, and we're always looking forward for more engagement right from the beginning with all of our countries. A lot of our funds go towards physical infrastructure projects, things that, though, provide a conducive environment for the private sector. So we have very much a physical infrastructure focus, but also a policy focus within the programs, supporting governments as they try and make more conducive environments to long-term investments. So we will get involved in, softer elements, whether it's a credit bureau or a commercial court. But we very much, right from the beginning, are engaging with businesses locally and internationally. On the agriculture side, the kind of defining guidance that we have, we always talk about ABC, the A for adequate skills and knowledge, that's locally. Backbone infrastructure, lots of our investment in the agricultural area tend to be in farm-to-market roads, or it can be large irrigation projects. And also the third part, the C, conducive policy environment. Certainly reiterating what my colleagues on this panel and previous ones have said about the environment for doing business in the countries that we're working. That conducive policy environment could be, land issues, land tenure, land rights, as have been raised a number of times before this morning, but all at the micro level, land, but at more macro level, again, activities to support anti-corruption activities and the disciplines that are already evolving in the countries where we're working. In fact, it's one of the primary defining factors of what countries are allowed to even be eligible for MCC funds is being above the median compared to peer countries, meaning either low income or lower middle income on the World Bank Brookings anti-corruption indicator. As I said, reiterating private sector engagement from the beginning, we're looking to hear from agricultural and other private sector investors. There are mechanisms we're evolving to try and find small joint funding facilities for small projects within or adjacent to the projects. And we also very much want to know what are those things that we, as a funder, an investor, we very consciously refer to our funds as investments. What are those things that we can best do on the public good side to better enable more successful long-term private investments?
Thank you, Stuart.
At this point.
Thank you very much. Now let's turn to Akobundu Ejasa. And can you tell us about OPIC exposure and plans in the agribusiness sector in Africa?
Sure, I'll keep it brief. So, for those of you who do not know, OPIC is the U.S. government's development finance institution. Essentially, our role is to spur, catalyze, and facilitate private capital into the markets that we invest in, Africa being a large component of it. Our exposure actually to Africa is 25% of our portfolio, which is the largest exposure we have across our entire 16.5 billion allocated. We have three mediums through which we actually spur capital: direct financing, political risk insurance, and then investing in private equity funds. Our focus in agriculture, there's a keen focus on agriculture across the entire emerging market space, and also particularly on Africa. There's an effort for us to actually double our exposure in the next 3 to 5 years, particularly in the realm of agriculture and across the Africa space, sub-Saharan Africa space. We've supported, from a private equity standpoint, a couple of transactions directly focused on primary, secondary, and tertiary agriculture, and then also exclusively focused on primary agriculture. Indirectly, I'll also say that we're a part of the Feed the Future program, which is a collective amongst USAID, OPIC, and other U.S. government agencies. So indirectly through that initiative, we're also supporting the development and spurring of agriculture across the continent.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there are many questions that would come from the floor, but I'm told by the organizers that the question will be asked during lunchtime. So let me ask you to give a round of applause to our panelists.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.